Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is an incredible turnout. I'm so honored, so excited to discover this incredible museum. I wish that I had spent the entire day here. And thank you so much for doing this with me.
My pleasure. And so I am the interviewer, so I'm also a college professor at DePaul, and I always like to give a roadmap for what we're going to be doing. And so we're going to start with a little bit about the book from the author herself, and then a little reading of an excerpt to give you a taste of it. And then we're going to do roughly 30 minutes of conversation between ourselves. And then that's when you come in, and we're going to do audience Q&A for 10 or 15 minutes at the end. So as we go, think of your questions, because I bet that you'll have answers. So take it away.
I hope I'll have answers. Yes, so for those of you who have not yet read the book, Sweet Fury is a literary thriller, and it's about a famous film actress whose name is Lila Crayne. She's America's sweetheart. She's adored throughout the whole world. And at the start of the book, she and her famous film director boyfriend, Kurt Royall, moved from LA to the West Village in New York City because they are preparing to make a feminist adaptation of Fitzgerald's final completed novel, Tender is the Night, which they're shooting in the Hamptons. And so she's playing the leading role, Nicole Diver, in the film. And so to prepare for the role, she begins working with a therapist in the West Village to dig into her own trauma of her own past to prepare. And as she is on the therapy couch, her life begins to unravel, and the characters in the book soon become entangled in a deadly game of revenge. So here is... Ooh, indeed. So here's a little excerpt. I'm just going to read the prologue because it's super short, and if I read anything after that, I start to give up spoilers. She stands there in the aftermath, trapped behind a wall of glass in a silent, seismic horror. Outside, dawn is just beginning its pearl, the sky over the Hudson a blooming bruise, skin of the water slate to silver, fingers of fog curling in. The world a milky calm, still unmarred by the carnage within. But she knows nothing will ever be the same again. Her stunned gaze travels down to her dress, stippled darkly with red, her innocent hands somehow sticky with blood. So much blood everywhere, so terribly bright. Her stomach swells. She can't think of it. She takes in the surviving remnants of the devastated room, the black book, the apocalyptic painting, the gold mask with its unseeing eyes, the knife. Beyond the glass, the clouds shift, and the blade flashes, blinding. She won't look at the slump of flesh on the floor, puddles still spreading, the sick within her rising. No. She must put a stop to it, once and for all. He's turned towards the balcony, backlit against the horizon's slow swell, one foot lunging before the other in a runner's stance, as though it might be any other morning, as though he might simply go for a jog, return with a coffee steaming in the early chill. In the distance, one by one, the green lights of the shore beyond begin to blink out. She must act quickly. Time is running out, and she's still in mortal danger. She presses her palms to her ears, forces her focus to the sound of that soothing inner swirl, draws within herself, a plucked chord singing to stillness, breathes. She opens her eyes, unlocks her phone, and then she places the call. "Please help me," she whispers, and the tears begin to stream. "Someone's been stabbed. Oh God, I think he's dead."
All right, I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to start with, I love getting to do these because my favorite question is sort of where an author's spark to embark on the whole project comes from. And so my question is kind of, which came first in your book? Because it's so steeped in, it's F. Scott Fitzgerald, but it's also a thriller. And so I'm curious, did you start from the idea I want to write a thriller, and then Fitzgerald came later? Or did you start with like, I'm obsessed with Fitzgerald and I want to write something about him, and then you were like, oh my gosh, a thriller? Or was it neither of those things?
Yeah. It's an interesting story. So as my aunt mentioned, I started as an actor and then had a career for 11 years as a professional theater director on Broadway and off. And I was the associate director in 2020 of Dear Evan Hansen on Broadway and the national tour, which basically meant that I was running and overseeing these shows. So that was my full-time job. And then on March 12th or whatever day it was, I was in the rehearsal room putting in an actor for the show that night. And we got the call that the industry was shutting down. And so just like that, my industry went away. Up until that point, I had written my whole life, but it always had come secondary to theater. I'd written 2 novels. One was horrible, which nobody will ever read, and the second one was okay, but it was not published. And so at this point, I had amassed some connections in the publishing world, but didn't have a publishing deal yet. And so I had no industry. It was in the pandemic. I had nothing to do but sit and mope and walk my dogs with a mask on. And so I went to an agent that I developed a relationship with, and I pitched her 5 ideas for 5 different books. And one of those, the last one that I pitched her, she said, that's the book that you need to write. That's the book that I've never read before. And to answer your question, I kind of bullshitted, right? It was just like a paragraph of an idea. I didn't really know what the book was about, but I had 2 ideas. I knew that I wanted to document the relationship between an actress and her therapist through their therapy session notes together. And then I had the idea for the book's big final twist. So I had the beginning and the ending, but I didn't know how to get from A to Z. And so I wrote the first draft really fast in like 6 months, and I submitted it to my writers group. And at that point, I mentioned they're making a film in the book. At that point, it was a made-up film, and it was horrible. And I knew that it was a placeholder, but I didn't know how to fix it. And so I submitted this draft to my group. And one of the writers in my group, this incredible novelist, Blair Hurley, who you should all read if you have never read her before, she said, the themes and the subject matter of your book are really reminding me of Tender as the Night. What if your characters were making an adaptation of Tender? And I had never read Tender as the Night. I had only ever read The Great Gatsby. And so I stopped everything and I read Tender as the Night, and I realized her suggestion was genius. And so then I went down this Fitzgerald rabbit hole where I love research. So I read literally everything that Fitzgerald ever wrote and almost every single book that was ever written about him. And the deeper that I dug, the more I realized that Sweet Fury wanted to be in conversation not just with Tender as the Night, but with his entire body of work.
That's a heck of a writing group. That's amazing.
They're amazing.
So I want to talk more about the book specifically, but I am interested in the sort of way that you kind of started as an actor and then a director, and then became more focused on writing. So can you talk a bit about your experiences in those fields and like how, if at all, those skills are transferable? Like, do you feel like it gave you like an edge as a writer, having worked in staged narrative?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it certainly helped with the subject matter of this book because this takes place in the film industry. There's a lot of like inside baseball between actors and directors and writers. But yes, so basically, just to give you a brief history, as I said, I began as an actor. I started acting professionally when I was 6 because I was one of those incurably shy children. And my mom said, this has got to change. And so she said, theater is the answer. She had me audition for a show. I got in. I did it. She said, okay, you're cured. Moving on. And I said, no, I found my passion. And so then I began acting professionally, regional theater, community theater, children's theater, and this is mostly in San Diego. And then as I got into high school, I also got into film and TV as well. And I started after school some days, would drive up to LA and do film and TV, and sometimes shooting in the middle of the night and then driving back in the middle of the night and going to school. While all of that was happening, my amazing mentor and theater teacher in high school said, I think you have an eye for directing. So I began to direct a little bit in high school and found that I really liked it too, but I was still very much had my blinders on and was determined that I was going to be an actor when I grew up. When the time came to figure out what college I was going to go to, I was really torn as to whether I wanted to go the more academic route or whether I wanted to go the conservatory route. Ultimately, I chose Princeton because of its creative writing program. It's one of the best in the country. And so I went through that. As my aunt mentioned, I studied with Joyce Carlos and Jeffrey Eugenides. Joyce was my advisor for my thesis. That was the first horrible novel. And it was horrible because my other thesis that my aunt mentioned was directing both parts of Angels in America, which is an 8-hour play, and the play opened the week that the novel was due. So it was an impossible task. And then I moved on to, as I mentioned, this theater directing career. But I was always, I always had writing sort of in my back pocket. I wrote this second novel. I created this writers group that we've been 16 years strong, and as of this year, all 5 of us are published novelists, which is incredible. And they've been my backbone, and this book would not exist without them. But to answer your question, I think one of the reasons that I decided to make that shift from acting to directing was that I enjoyed directing's much broader scope. I think the way I sort of see it is that as an actor, you are one very important piece of a puzzle, and as a director, your job is to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So I really loved that challenge. I loved working intimately with the actors. I loved sort of creating the broader vision of the show. I loved working with the designers and creating it visually, bringing it to life. And so these are all sort of like elements of control, and I certainly like control. So writing is just sort of like a further step of that, right? Where with writing books, you get to create the characters and the plot and the world of the book itself. But I do think, directing theater, coming from that professional world, I had built in an intimate understanding of pacing and tension, and in terms of building character, of motive and action and conflict for all the characters, and theatricality and drama and stakes. And those things really helped me immensely as I taught myself really how to build a suspense novel. On a more personal note, this book, which we may get into, sort of deals with some Me Too themes. And I will say that I both witnessed and was subjected to prejudice, both as an actor and as a director. I mean, I think we all know that for female actors, both in TV and film and in theater, there's a huge emphasis placed on being young and beautiful and small and thin. And for me, growing up as a teenager and trying to figure out my own body and my own insecurities, constantly being judged based on my self-worth based on my appearance was an immense source of anxiety and insecurity for me. And I knew that as I got older, it was only going to get worse as a woman. And that was something that I really, didn't want to deal with. And so that's one of the reasons that I left acting behind. When it came to directing, I think everyone knows that the film and TV world is very much still a gentleman's club. That's very true still of the theater world as well. There are a handful of female directors who have made their way to the top, and some of them are incredible at helping other women. And there are others that do have reputations for going out of their way to do the opposite. I think because they are so few and far between. And so for me, as a director, most times I would find myself at the head table and I was the only woman. And I found that I had to get really good at shape-shifting and transforming myself based on the specific scenario that I was in order to get ahead. And this book sort of pushes that idea to the extreme and explores the dangers and the consequences of that gamesmanship.
Excellent answer. So, you've already said the characters are working on this feminist adaptation of Tender as the Night, and she's playing Nicole. And I'm curious, how familiar or not do you think readers need to be with that specific book or with just Fitzgerald's work in general?
My hope is that you don't have to be familiar at all. And that is the feedback that I've gotten, so I'm hoping it's true. I think my hope is that people that haven't read Fitzgerald or only read Gatsby, and it was, back in high school, that they can read this and that I hold your hand enough to get you through the basics of what you need to know. And you can just appreciate it on the thriller level, but definitely for people that do love Fitzgerald and are intimately acquainted, this book is just filled. I mean, there are hundreds of Easter eggs in this book. And so my hope is that it is, extra delightful for those people that really love his work, because there are so many call outs to not only all of his novels, but many of his short stories as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it works. I don't know, when I teach, I say that allusions should only add. They should never leave anyone out, and I think you've hit that.
Thank you.
But for those, it's very if you know, you know, and it is like a chocolate chip cookie where the chips are Fitzgerald quotes, and they're tasty. And so I'm curious from a craft perspective, how did you, because you said, and I can tell, I'm so glad you said it, because I was I knew it, that you read everything, but how did you decide which of the many, many passages to include? And then more interestingly, because it's not just in there to be in their's sake, it's very tied to each of the characters, different people at different times, or thinking or quoting or being echoed. And so how did you put the chips in the cookie?
Oh yeah, it was a little back-asswards. I think as I mentioned, I had written this really quickly, and I had done so. One of the reasons, it's really funny that I wrote a thriller, because I'm scared of action movies. So but one of the reasons why I did it was because I thought, when I looked at myself as a writer, I thought that my weakness was in plot and structure. And so I said, I got to fix this. How am I going to fix this? Well, thrillers live and die by plot. If you don't have a tight plot, it does not work. And so I took this as a challenge, and I went from being a pantser, where you're basically just sort of writing into the ether and hoping that it's going to come together, where I would inevitably write myself into a corner, to now I am a diehard plotter. And I hate writing outlines. They're miserable, but they are the scaffolding, the jungle gym on which I can play. So I had created not bulletproof, but a tight outline before I even began. And so because Fitzgerald came in later, I had a pretty strong sense of the story and the characters and sort of all of, the way in which the plot was braided together. And so since Fitzgerald was this huge second layer that came in once the plot was already there, reading all of his work with that in the back of my head, I was reading selfishly, totally. So I amassed a Bible, basically, of Fitzgerald that I thought, oh, this could potentially be a tie into Sweet Fury, and I way overwrote and put way too much, and then it was just it became an art of just picking out and pulling out until I just sort of had the essence.
Was it hard to get permission to use all of those?
Well, almost all of them are in the public domain. Tender as the Night was tricky, because it is not. And, my book, so I had to be very careful, and that is one of the reasons why the book is in conversation with his entire work and not just with Tender as the Night. But I will say that it is in many ways a love letter to Fitzgerald. As I mentioned, I first read Gatsby in high school, and I loved it when I read it in high school. One of my favorite things as a reader are authors that have incredibly lyrical, poetic language, and Fitzgerald is just the master of that. His prose is exquisite. And that is, I think Gatsby is the masterpiece, but it's there in all of his works. However, while it is in part a love letter to his works, it is also a critique of his work. It is not looking, just revering Fitzgerald. So, as I did all of this research about Fitzgerald and became more acquainted with the writer and Fitzgerald the man, I also came to understand his shortcomings. And what I'm talking about here, what I take issue with are, the racism, the sexism, the anti-Semitism, the homophobia, the classism, all of the isms. And of those, Sweet Fury addresses the misogyny in his writing. And To be fair, he wrote this, he was writing 100 years ago. He's a product of his time. And yet, at the same time, does that mean that we should give him a pass? Should we continue to revere him as the great American writer, or should these failings in some way be addressed? And so Sweet Fury is my attempt to do that.
Yeah, and early on, I'm going to quote a little bit of your book too, because I love to quote, because it's so fun to quote. Lila Crayne, the Nicole Diver, the actress, says, "Our version of Tender isn't another tragedy of the tortured white man. It's a feminist story of healing, of reparation." And she adds that Nicole has overcome her trauma and reclaimed her life. And so I think one of the main questions that the book sort of seems to ask is, I want to ask partly about that. You've kind of touched on this, canonical people who we don't necessarily want to de-pedestal, but we want to see in all of their facets. And then also this question of who is or isn't a victim, and the revenge comes in, but the concept of justice. So can you talk a little bit more about all of that stuff in the book?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of Me Too stories out there. A lot of them are revenge stories. I think in writing this book, one of the most important things for me was to avoid a story that felt black and white. I wanted everyone and everything in this book to live in the gray area, because that for me felt most true to my experience of life. So there is no character in this book that is strictly a hero or strictly a villain. They are all, to varying degrees, limited and flawed human beings. They all also have hidden identities. There's only, I think, one character in the book who is who they seem to be from beginning to end. The title of the third section of the book is a quote taken from Tender is the Night: "We must all try to be good." And I chose that for many reasons, but one of which is that each and every one of these characters is trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and that kind of I love too, because it seems like the book is very self-aware in talking about those things, but also in some people not wanting to talk about those things. Mm-hmm. And at one point, you have Lila talking to this colleague Nancy, another woman in the industry, and says, "Men prey on women over and over through the generations, continually coveting the younger, shinier model. And as a result, women are stripped of individuality when viewed through the male gaze." And that's what Lila sort of is saying kind of in this conversation about the project. And then Nancy says, "Oh, that's good. Very woke." And I guess I'm, curious, did you think that? Did you have this whole woke, anti-woke thing in your mind? Or were you I'm just going to entertain? Or how did you navigate that? I think you navigated it well, because first and foremost, this is just a page turner, a stay up late and cancel your morning appointments kind of thing, but it's also a thinker. So how did you handle that?
Yeah, the woke line is just to really undercut myself. I don't want to take it too seriously, but yeah, I think I wanted with all of these characters, because nobody is a hero or a villain, a lot of these characters are dealing with serious trauma. That is a theme in this book. And so there are a lot of things happen in this book that are absolutely reprehensible. But my hope is for the reader's experience that as you go through and you become more and more horrified, that you can also still always understand why they did what they did, even if you disagree with it. That you can always maintain a degree of empathy with each of these characters, no matter who turns into a monster.
Yeah, and with that, one of the things I like about doing these things is I get an advanced reader copy, so I get to read it before most people get to read it, and the ARCs come with things like the Dear Reader letter. And in your Dear Reader letter, you have this thing that I think is very relevant to what we're saying now, where you call Sweet Fury a book for the romantic at heart. And I read that at the beginning, and I was like, okay. And then as I was reading the book, I was like, what kind of romantic is this book for? And I loved it because I think, one of the things the book does is that there's characters who have romantic ideas of who they are and what they're doing or what they've done in their past or what they think they're doing with their present actions. And then, like any good thriller, there's all these crosses and double crosses and things aren't what they seem. But I'm curious, do you consider yourself a romantic, and how do you see this book as romantic?
That's such a good question. I've never been asked that before. Well, I definitely am a romantic. And Jonah, who is one of the main characters and who absolutely adores and reveres Fitzgerald, is a total romantic. I think, I don't know, this is a bit of a tangent, but, something that's sort of bringing up for me is thinking about the locations of these books and sort of why I chose to set them there, which is both the Hamptons and the West Village, which are, to me, these places that are very sort of Fitzgeraldian, in that the Hamptons is a stone's throw from where Gatsby was set, of course, but they are also representative of his trademark subject matter, and he is such a romantic, right? And their romantic beauty, the ostentatious wealth, the hedonistic lifestyle, and in sort of a larger scope, Sweet Fury is commentary on America's persistent obsession with money. To be successful in America is to be rich. This is as true today as it was 100 years ago when Gatsby was written. And so, the romanticism for me comes, a lot of it, in sort of the depictions of these beautiful idealized locations, their idealized lives. And my intention there was to depict these, the sort of perfect West Village, the perfect Hamptons, in all of their beauty, and then peel back the skin to the gritty underbelly of this world where fame and wealth persist in being our cultural religion. So I'm trying to portray the romantic's view of life and then show sort of the ugliness underneath. It's both.
Yeah, and I just to so it's almost, I have 2-3 more questions, and then it's your time to shine. So get your questions fired up. But building on that, because I definitely Jonah, the psychiatrist, is this, I think, super fascinating character because he, without giving too much away, has these very noble ideas of himself, and then as the book unfolds, you realize that perhaps he has been deluding himself. But there's a passage on page 176 where he thinks about beauty and how people often want to believe that beautiful people are good and truthful. And it says, all his life, he'd felt an insatiable romantic hunger for beauty, conflating it in that Kantian way as the symbol of the morally good. And so I just think that's inherently interesting. And so 2 parts. What is it about beauty and how we just get bamboozled by it? And 2, I think the book is very, we could hear in just the passage that we heard at the beginning, it's in this lush, plush, Fitzgeraldian prose, and you're using this beautiful language to write about some pretty twisted stuff by the end. So how did you, decide to handle beauty and ugliness in the book?
I just feel like it's such an American thing, right? I mean, it's, for me, and this is another reason why this is set in the film industry, where, we're obsessed with famous people and celebrity. It's ridiculous, but America is. And beauty and glamour and wealth and all of these sort of surface and really, at the end of the day, meaningless things. And so that paragraph, to me, is representative of sort of a inherited cultural mindset in America. And it's also something that I deal with every day too. I put myself in that situation. I deliberately set the novel in this film industry where women in particular have this impossible balancing act to pull off. Lila is incredibly beautiful and also incredibly clever, and she is burying past trauma and hiding current abuse, all while projecting this perfect image of America's sweetheart that the world expects of her.
All right, last official question. In the Dear Reader letter, you use this metaphor that I really like, because I'm always thinking about what is reading? We're all here at the American Writers Museum, and what is the magic of reading? And so you say, I think of my stories as a crystal prism. I spend years cutting the glass just so, fine-tuning the angles and edges as best I can. Left on its own, it's only a pretty piece of glass. The questions, in the story remain questions. You, dear reader, are the light. So I want to pause and just appreciate that. Isn't that cool? A cool way to describe reading. But I'm interested in what books, besides Fitzgerald, obviously, you as a reader helped you decide to write this. Were there thrillers, or were there, other things about the industry, or how did you get your prism to make, to come into being?
Lauren Groff is a huge inspiration for me. This is something kind of crazy that I do, but every single year I reread Fates and Furies. It's one of my favorite books. I just think she's sort of the Fitzgerald's contemporary in terms of exquisite language. I think nobody does prose better than her, and I find something new every time. So she is a huge inspiration in terms of sort of the lyrical language that I strive to do. Donna Tartt is another. She's, I hope someday I might sort of climb in that direction as a writer. But she's the master. And I'm just waiting for that fourth novel to come out. Yes. Yes. I mean, I could give you a whole laundry list of all my favorite authors. But
that's great. Secret History forever. If you haven't read the Donna Tartt Secret History, read it. Read it tonight. I can come up with more. I have more questions, but it's your turn, so I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you raise your hand, we have this microphone that we would request that you use.
So have you returned to directing, and what's in your future? Are you a writer or a director or both?
Yeah. I have not returned to directing. This has been amazingly a full-time job, which is such a gift, and I am finding it to be really satisfying because while I love theater and love directing, and I think I was good at it, I am totally an introvert at heart, and I really love just being in my own little bubble and creating the worlds of these books. I've written the first draft of my next novel, which is under contract, so that's on its way. Thanks. It's a mess, guys, but it's on its way. It's much more ambitious. I'm really excited about it. But the pipe dream, if you're asking, is this is making the rounds in LA, for an adaptation, and somewhere, not for this, but just somewhere down the line in my career, it would be amazing if I could get to a place where I could adapt and direct the projects myself.
Another question?
Hi. An incredible story. I'm so eager to read the book. I'm curious to know how the two of you know one another, because Kathleen Rooney obviously is an accomplished novelist and scholar and educator. So.
And I am not.
Oh, no, you, but so much too. But I'm just curious to know your relationship.
Yeah, the American Writers Museum just knows me and thought of me and had this event in the offing and asked if I would like to do it. And I said yes, because I am an extrovert and I love meeting new people. And I don't know, I think of these opportunities as like a fun homework assignment. I mean, there's a reason I'm a professor. I never wanted to not be in school. I'm like a huge dork. And so it's a fun way to get myself to read stuff that I might not find on my own or just like push me outside my normal pattern. So I'm so glad I said yes.
I
Oh.
just assumed you were Girl Scouts.
That would be cool.
That would be really cool.
We got one up at the front.
So Sash,
Yes.
I feel like I could answer this question because I'm your uncle, and hopefully it's not too personal. But you live in New York, in the West Village, in a fairly small place with four
That's
cats.
putting it mildly.
Oh yeah, how many square feet?
650 square feet.
650 square feet with 4 cats. A couple are semi-feral.
One feral.
One feral. Mm-hmm. 2 dogs.
Mm-hmm. Big dogs.
A brand new husband over here, Ben. 2 boys on weekends.
Yeah.
How do you find it possible to write one coherent word and find the space to do that?
It's a
I would
really
go
good
crazy. I
question.
couldn't do it.
Yeah. Well, I wrote this during the pandemic. We were in a different apartment. We were in a much bigger apartment. So it remains to be seen. But I will say that what makes me really happy, sort of my happy morning as a writer, is I have the animals all gather kumbaya style around me. So I have the 2 dogs on the floor. One is usually like belly up. And then I have a cat in my lap, a cat on my keyboard stepping on the keys. I have a cat draped across my shoulders, so I'm like this. And then the feral cat's in the closet. And that just makes me so happy. I mean, my husband is in the other, we only have 2 rooms. My husband's in the other room, like booming on Zoom, doing all of his calls throughout the day. And so I've usually got like noise canceling headphones, but as long as I have the animals, I'm happy.
Did you work with an editor? And if so, what is that process like? You have your baby that you've written, and somebody comes in and gives you notes.
Yeah, well, it was great. I love my editor. She is one of the sort of top of the rung at Simon & Schuster, the flagship imprint. Her name's Karina Guiderman. But basically, because it was a debut, and I don't know if this was your experience too, but it's just so hard to get a book sold when nobody knows who you are, that you have to get the book super polished before it's ready to go out to editors. And so, I had done all of the editing with my amazing writers group I'm serious when I'm saying this book wouldn't exist without my writers group. They really helped form this book. And then I had to find agents. And I basically shot for the stars and just emailed blind the fanciest agents that I could find, one of whom responded and said, give me the weekend, I'm halfway through. And then by Monday, she had offered to work with me. It was amazing. And I spent, a year and a half editing with them. She's a tastemaker in the industry, and she said, this is a great book, it's gonna be a big book, it's gonna be the next Gone Girl, but it needs a lot of work. And so it was a year and a half of editing, and especially the ending, oh my God, it was like 4 months of just reworking the ending. And I actually got to a place where I was like, I can't see straight. I don't think I can edit it any further. And she was like, okay, well then we're not gonna be able to send it to like big editors because they're not gonna take it because it needs more work. And I was like, oh shit, I'm like, I'll edit more, And so it was so edited by the time that it went out to publishing houses that I did have another, year of editing with my editor, but there were no huge changes at that point. It was just fine-tuning, refining, and it certainly made the book a lot better, but the major, the meat of the work happened with my agents.
I love your presentation and the professor's snappy questions. It's been great. I had a question about your process.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of writing or even just starting to write something, do you have a schedule during the day where I'm up at 6, the cats and I are writing by 6:30, and I stop at noon every day and try to stick to that, or what is your process?
I have to work out before I'm like obsessed with working out, so that's what I do first thing to wake myself up. But then, I have to start writing in the morning. I find that if I wait until the afternoon, I'm just screwed for the rest of the day, and the writing is total crap. My process, as I said, I rely on an outline. So my next book it's a 40-page outline, and this is not like bullet points. This is like paragraphs, so 40 pages. And so this is my Bible. And then I do the word count thing. So I write 2,000 words a day, and then I stop. And the words I'm telling you are horrible. They are almost always horrible, but I allow myself that grace because for me, the scariest thing is the blank page. And just once I have those crappy words on the page, I know I can go back and edit it.
We have time for like one more, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. You are younger than many of the people in your audience,
Yeah.
which is its own delight. Tell us a little bit about your attitude towards what the world is like at this point. When I heard references to Joyce Carol Oates, all I could think of is the terrible books that she had written in which all is black. until it gets blacker. And then it's charcoal. And then it gets worse. So how do you view the world other than around with cats around you and a smiling husband over there?
Well, he's the optimist of the two of us, so you might not like my answer. I'm definitely more pessimistic, but I will say I have a good sense of humor, but my humor is dark. Joyce is a very dark writer, for sure. I also think she's a brilliant writer. I think I'm tentatively optimistic, but I'm more of a realist than an optimist, I would say. I think this is kind of an answer to your question, but I think one of the things that as I'm figuring out who I am as a writer and what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get to this sweet spot where I'm writing a book that's twisty and fun that people want to pick up and not put down, and then sneak in there something that I think our society needs to look at. And so for this book, it is the cultural, persistent, systemic misogyny that is just continuing and not going away. And with the next book, it's the climate crisis. So I want to give people something that is escapist and fun and brings them joy in their life, but also makes people think about something that I think is important to think about.
Will you sign books for people if they get
Yes.
copies?
Yes.
All
And
right.
can we thank Kathleen Rooney and Sash Bischoff?